Hello, everyone. Welcome to Preparing to Teach as Full-Time Faculty in an Equity-Minded Institution. I'm Elisa Meyer, Chair of the English Department and Chair of Institutional Effectiveness.
Hi, everyone. I'm Erica Onuga, a colleague in the English department as well. So now that we've done introductions, we're going to jump into the presentation.
Oh, yes. So one thing we thought we should do is clarify a couple of things before we get into some of the content. You know, as an institution, as individuals, we can't assume that we already are equity-minded. We need to think of ourselves on an ongoing equity journey and not headed for a destination in particular. That's super important. And lastly, that it's not something, equity is not something achieved at one point, like you need to sustain it and do constant work towards it. So try to think of it as being on some type of equity-minded continuum.
That's a great way to put it. Okay. And before we get into the details of the presentation, we just want to provide an overview of the learning objectives, which I'm sure all of you are happy to see, more learning objectives. But we want to be clear about what we're going to cover in this workshop because equity is a really big topic and obviously we can't cover everything. So the focus of this workshop will be to do a couple of things. We'll define equity-mindedness. You'll understand the steps for institutions to address equity gaps, as well as the steps that individuals need to take to become equity-minded. And then finally, you'll start developing your own personal plan to become equity-minded. And of course, as Elisa mentioned, we're also available after the workshop if you have additional questions.
Okay, so we thought we also should have a couple of community agreements. No one knows everything. Together, we know a lot, right? We don't expect any of us to be fully experts in this topic, but we want to make sure that we're creating an environment where we all learn from each other. One voice at a time, please. And I think this will be fine. And Zoom's a little easier to control the one voice at a time. You want to make sure that that you're challenging yourself to create space for others to speak. I think depending on the type of person you are, that may be easier. I'm a chit chatter by nature. And so when I walk into spaces, I have to make sure that I balance my speaking with creating a space for others to give their opinion. I think sometimes if you're more introverted, it's a little easier to do that. So just be mindful if you think you're the only person talking, that may be a cue for you to take a step back and let somebody else speak. And then use I statements rather than generalizations. That becomes quite important because, you know, we want to make sure that we're not making sweeping conclusions about groups of people. And challenge your assumptions. That is super important, particularly in equity work. And really think about the difference between intention and impact. The example I've often given people is, and I'm sure my mother will love that I give an example on a recording. She'll be so grateful for that. But growing up, my mom would always be very mindful of what my weight was because in my family, we can tend to be more overweight. And so she would constantly say like, are you going to eat that? Or is that? And her intention was to make sure that in the long run, I was a healthier person. But that didn't mean it didn't have an impact on how I saw myself, right? And so when we tell people that we didn't intend to say something, that doesn't really correlate to how a person feels once we've said it or done it, right? So those are just some things to keep in mind that as we're talking today.
And then again, because equity is a really big topic that we can't fully cover in just one workshop, we are starting with some assumptions. And if you have any questions about these assumptions or you'd like additional readings, again, we can provide more resources for the basis of these assumptions. But beginning this workshop, we're assuming that we all live at intersections. We all benefit and are harmed by systematic oppression, right? Our identities are all really complex. We all come from different perspectives. But what brings equity practitioners together is a goal of working against and trying to change systematic oppression. It's not useful to argue about which system is worse. You know, we don't participate in, you know, competitions. Again, the ultimate goal is, again, to address systematic oppression. And regardless of, you know, our backgrounds, our varying and complex identities, that's what unites us as we come together to do this work. all systems are interconnected. That's really important as well. With a lot of equity work, we focus on racial disparities, and there's a lot of research behind that. However, we find that the focusing on racial disparities actually impacts students from a broad range of identities and backgrounds as well. So when we think about, again, systematic change, that's really the ultimate goal. Dismantling systems of oppression benefits everyone. And again, since we're all impacted by these systems, if we dismantle the systems of oppression, there's benefits for everyone. So again, when we think about equity work, it's not just targeting particular groups. We choose particular groups to focus on for our immediate impact, but in terms of the benefit, we'll see benefits for the entire community. And then finally, opposing systems of oppression, building alternatives, and cultural change are all necessary. So we think about equity work, right? Our work obviously begins with our work as faculty members in our particular institution. But again, the ultimate focus is really these kind of larger systems of change at the institutional level, and they may even go beyond that as well. So that's kind of the broad perspective that's taken when undertaking equity work.
And something I'd just like to quickly add before we move on to another assignment, if you're thinking about trying to create space in your classes for people from various intersectionalities, but especially people of color to engage in dialogue and the activities, think about ways that you can take these community agreements and assumptions and create space in your classroom for students to really collectively sign on to this being the way in which they engage each other and you.
It's really helpful. Okay, so when we start thinking about equity, I just want to provide so we want to provide some resources. And when we think about equity, a lot of the resources are going to be data informed. Sometimes people are surprised to find out just how much research has been done on that. And we rely on the research to really help inform the decisions so that we're not doing things in a kind of ad hoc way. We're really doing it, again, in a systematic way. So that kind of systematic analysis and research can lead to that systematic change that we've been talking about. And then the research centers and some of the common ones that we use at SMC because of proximity and just because of their fabulous resource, and some of which we'll share later on. It's the USC Race and Equity Center, as well as the Community College Equity Assessment Lab out of San Diego State. And if you've attended other workshops or if you see future ones, you'll probably find that there are a lot of colleagues who are working with those institutes as well. So again, we can't cover everything, but if you want more information or just want to learn more about equity research in general, these would be great places to start.
Yes, in the USC Race and Equity Center, you may see some resources that refer to CUE, which is the Center for Urban Education, and that's headed by Dr. Estela Ben-Simon, who is retiring at the end of, I think, next month. Moment of sadness. And but that center is being folded into the USC Race and Equity Center. So when you see CUE come up, you'll notice that there's a lot of, I'm sure they'll maintain their website, or at some point they may migrate materials from there over to the USC Race and Equity Center website.
So the first thing to think about is, what is equity mindedness, right? So we keep talking about it. You probably heard about it, in many department meetings. You've probably written about it in program review. But we think about equity mindedness, it's really about a particular perspective. And again, that's what Elisa was alluding to. She talks about this equity journey. It's really about changing how we think about the work that we do and how we approach our work with our students. So equity mindedness refers to this perspective of practitioners who call attention to patterns of inequity in student outcomes. So again, the focus is really on what's happening to our students, what are the patterns that we see through the research, and then from there, we can begin to think about how to create systematic change. So when becoming an equity-minded practitioner, there are a couple of things that you can do, again, to kind of facilitate that change in perspective. So equity-minded practitioners, they question their own assumptions. And this can be really challenging, I think, as faculty, especially if we've been trained to think about things in a certain way, or to think about education or the way that we do our work in a certain way. But it really starts with questioning those assumptions, those things we've kind of taken for granted, and say, are there other ways of thinking about it? Are there other perspectives that haven't been considered? We want to recognize stereotypes that harm student success. We're definitely going to talk about that more in a little bit. We're going to continually reassess the practices to create change. So again, what are we doing that can make a difference in the outcomes that we see in our students? So again, it's really about focusing on what we do in the classroom, as well as in our roles as part of a larger institution. And then finally, Practitioners reflect and assume accountability and responsibility for addressing the gaps that students experience. So again, it's really about kind of shifting and saying, what am I doing as a faculty member? What can I be doing differently? And then taking responsibility if you notice that there are some gaps and saying, okay, this is happening in my classroom or in my spaces. What can be done about it? And really taking the initiative and responsibility for it as opposed to focusing somewhere else. So it's really about that kind of internal reflection before we can begin to think about that larger systematic change.
And Erica, do you mind if I add something really quick?
Of course.
So I think that's one of the hugest things that I've learned over the last few years as I begin to do more and more equity minded work is oftentimes people assume that when a person is equity minded, that they've kind of, again, arrived at this certain location and they just sit there in their expertise. And having spent a lot of time with various equity practitioners on our campus, what I've come to realize is it's a constant rethinking and just challenging of the self and each other in a very collegial way, but in a way that helps us continue to grow and evolve as individuals. And so that continual reassessment is, and over time it becomes natural, right? So initially it may seem awkward or I don't want to say forced, but a little more complicated. And then over time you find yourself doing it anyway, which is wonderful, right?
Absolutely. And just to add to that, it reminds me of a workshop that I recently went to, and the presenter said that if you reach a point where you feel like you've kind of mastered equity, that's the time to really pause and reflect and say, "What am I missing?" So that was kind of a really good tip. And I think in some ways it can be folded into, like you said, a natural process because it's already kind of built in that we kind of stay current in the field, that we're constantly kind of assessing our teaching methods, finding about what's new. So it's really about kind of just centering equity in that work as well. Like as we're finding new methods, staying current on the latest research, is like, how is equity a part of that and really centering that? So we're thinking about our field in relation to student outcomes and what's happening with our students.
So we thought we would take a moment and really, following that thread of being equity minded, think about some common faculty statements. And this doesn't have to just be faculty. You can hear people say things of this nature in a variety of contexts in society. But these statements of like, many of our African American and Latino students come through underperforming high schools. They are unprepared for college. Our students work too many hours. They don't have time to study. They aren't engaged. Students, especially male minority students, do not utilize tutoring. They don't seek the help. And when we look at these statements, we can see that, as a matter of fact, I heard one of these statements in a meeting 2 days ago. And these statements aren't born out of, I should clarify, that most of the time when we make these statements, nobody is entering into a conversation thinking, I'm going to say this because it harms Black and Latinx students, right? And I think that's what's so tricky about really starting to challenge the ways in which so much of what we say and what we center is very subconscious. But if you're looking at these statements, you start to realize that places the onus of responsibility entirely on a student, right? Our students of color, who we all know have been disserved by a system that favors whiteness and privilege, right? So what we thought we could do, well, Erica, do you have anything to add, just in case before I?
No, I was just say that just to echo what you're saying, with a lot of this, when we're changing kind of our perspectives, I think it's important to recognize that, people aren't doing this maliciously.
Right.
The
Right.
intent, people are genuinely trying to understand what's going on with our students. But when we're doing equity work, we're really just reframing how we think and talk about our students so we can get to those, again, systematic changes in a more productive way. That's the only thing.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you added that. So what we thought we could do, and maybe we can pause the recording. Oh, wait, no, sorry. We have a slide that talks about, yeah, sorry, Erica.
No worries. So you may have heard about deficit mindedness, and we wanted to just kind of compare and contrast deficit mindedness to equity mindedness. And the previous slide gave some statements that were representative of deficit minded statements, right? So with the deficit minded frame, there's an emphasis on the qualities that students lack or knowledge that they should have. Students are responsible for inequities in their outcomes, and ultimately students are to blame for their unequal outcomes. Right? And I think one way to just kind of think about a deficit-minded frame is that students either have or they are the problem. Right? There's something wrong with students that needs to be fixed or addressed. Right? And if that's the frame or the lens that you're using, then it'll lead to certain kinds of programmatic changes, certain types of solutions. Whereas when you switch to an equity-minded frame, it leads to different conversations and different types of change. Right? So an equity-minded frame puts an emphasis on the institution for taking responsibility for those inequities in student outcomes. The institution is focusing on its own policies and practices. And I think this is really big, the institution meets students where they are. That's so big. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges sometimes in terms of doing the work. And then finally, there's a focus on factors that are within the realm of institutional control. So again, instead of focusing on the students and identifying any problems that maybe they may be perceived to have, the institution is then asking, okay, what can be done differently? How are things set up? How have things been organized in a way to serve students? Are we meeting students where they are? And again, asking those questions leads to, again, that accountability, that responsibility that we talked about earlier, and leads to fundamentally different types of solutions. So again, getting the framework and perceiving and asking different kinds of questions leads to that systematic change. So again, this kind of internal process, and I think Elisa said it best, right? This kind of ongoing process of kind of internal reflection, starting with the individual level with faculty, but again, kind of branching out from there is what really can lead to different outcomes. And that's how we can kind of close those equity gaps, not just kind of staying stuck in the deficit-minded frame where we're looking at students to solve these issues. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, you read my mind. So the other thing I just want to point out is, as faculty, we often put ourselves in some type of middle space. We think because we don't create overarching policies all the time, although if you're part of the Senate, you know we do contribute to academic regulations, but we often think, well, I'm just in the classroom relating to my students, but we still are an arm of the institution. And when you look at the policies that are in place, and the way you conduct your classroom, the protocols you use for assignments, all sorts of things, right? The way in which you grade or assess, those can all be centering the system rather than centering students. So you want to continue to think about ways in which, even if you don't want to be, you still are an arm of that system, right?
Absolutely. And I think, at least just based on our own department conversations, I mean, I think in light of the kind of dramatic changes we've had to make in response to, COVID, I mean, I think a lot of these conversations are coming up more frequently in terms of how we do things, how we, create alternatives to address the current situation. So again, it's really that kind of reframing and saying, where are students right now and how do we meet them, starting with what happens in the classroom. Absolutely.
Yeah. So we thought what we could do is a brief exercise, but for the sake of the recording, we will highlight an example of an equity-minded statement, right? So instead of saying students, especially male minority students, do not utilize tutoring, right? They don't seek the help. We could turn around and on the flip say, is our communication about tutoring effective in reaching our African American and Latino students, right? Or Latinx students. So again, from a statement that puts the onus on the student to a statement that asks about the ways in which we're communicating and inviting students. The English department, just to give an example, had for a long time a paper cutout of James Dean, who had been a student at SMC, and he was standing at the entrance of the Humanities Tutoring Center. And I didn't even, I mean, this was at a time where I wasn't even in this mindset, but I remember somebody saying to us, why would you put a poster of a movie icon, a white male movie icon from the 50s at the doorway of your tutoring center? And when they said that, I was like, yeah, I could see how that wouldn't be the most inviting thing. And it's not that whoever did that was thinking, I'm going to figure out a way to make people not feel welcome, right? No, they thought, well, this is a student we've had before, people know who he is. And so, thinking about it from our responsibility, that's what I was trying to say. So I think we should still maybe pause the recording and give people the opportunity to think about those other statements and how we can make them equity minded. Okay, so after having a little bit of a conversation with those of us that are participating today, we thought we would take a look at the third deficit-minded statement and think about how we can turn it into more of an equity-minded one. So this statement, many of our African American and Latino students come through underperforming high schools. They are unprepared for college. Again, I kid you not, I heard this yesterday or day before. And it's understandable. This is a very common statement that you could hear even at a dinner table conversation, right? But the one thing I think, and we can flip to just looking at a blank, but really moving it into that equity-minded statement is thinking about whether or not our students, whatever, regardless of their prior educational experience, right? It's so important that we center that they are with us now, and we need to meet our students wherever it is they're at, right? We can't think about whether or not they got what they needed or deserved in K through 12, right? We have to think about how, as an institution, we can make sure that they have what they need to thrive in their transfer institution or in the workplace and beyond. Erica, do you have anything you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I just agree with what you said. And I think one of the ways that we can shift how we think about and talk about our students is, again, to think about questioning our own assumptions and just asking questions, right? So instead of saying, this is what happened to our students, or assuming or generalizing about what happened to our students beforehand, which we really can't do anything about, we can ask, what do our students need now? And if we don't know the answer to that, then that's where the research can come in, where we, again, can make decisions based on our current students. So we're making sure that we're meeting the needs of the actual people who are here and not kind of imagining what we hope or want them to have in the abstract. That was the only thing.
Yes. No, I wholeheartedly agree.
And I think this is my slide.
Yes.
So moving on, so now that we've talked a little bit about equity mindedness, we wanted to introduce the equity vision statement and mission statement from SMC, because again, it's important to keep in mind that we're all kind of working, as Elisa said earlier, as part of a system, right? So we all have roles to play. As faculty members, we have control over what we do in our classrooms. We have a lot of flexibility in the policies and the decisions that we can make. But we're also working within a larger framework, the SMC and our institutions, if we're at other institutions as well, that have set out as well. So at SMC, the vision statement for equity is that SMC is a dynamic and culturally responsive educational community that upholds the values of equity, inclusion, and social justice as a pathway to personal and academic excellence. And I think that's really important to keep in mind, that SMC has explicitly outlined equity as a core value. So when we talk about doing equity work, it's not, again, something that's kind of happening off on the side. It's not, in addition to, the core work that we're doing. Equity is really supposed to be centered as part of our foundational work as practitioners at the institution. And then with the equity mission statement, SMC is an educational institution dedicated to providing an equitable learning and working environment. We intend to make clear through our lived values and praxis our commitment to inclusive excellence, which is reflected in our student outcomes and employee satisfaction. So again, the expectation for SMC as an entire institution is that equity is really folded into everything that we're doing. Again, it's not just this kind of side project that we're working on. It really has to be centered in from the very beginning. And again, it goes back to an equitable learning and working environment. So it's not just about what's happening in the classroom with our students, it's what's happening with employees. It's really about the entire community. And again, I think in a conversation earlier, Lisa explained this so well. So I'll give you the floor in a second. But it's really about thinking about the system as a whole. All right, again, sometimes I think this work can seem kind of partitioned or fragmented, but it's really ideally about everyone who's a part of the institution doing their part in centering equity. So that's really reflected in the classroom as well as the institution overall, and that you should be able to see it in tangible, meaningful ways, right? That equity isn't just, again, this abstract thing, but it's reflected in the policies. It's reflected in the decisions at every institutional level.
Oh, yes.
I know you do.
And I think, what I love about vision statements and mission statements is because they are representative of something that the institution wants to achieve, right? But also understanding that expectation and our reality are not instantaneously the same. We all have to keep working towards it and thinking about ways in which what we have right now works or doesn't work for our students of color. And I've often said to people that, to me, if you exist at an institution where your colleagues of color, and by colleagues, I mean not just faculty, I mean classified administrators, operations, if you work at an institution where your colleagues do not feel like they are championed and included, right? Then that can't, then it's, I have a hard time imagining that our students of color would feel differently, right? So really thinking about how we treat each other communicates to students some of their value, right? If they see us being dismissive of operations people or people in classified, then that does not send a message to them that we care about them, right?
Absolutely.
It's a little soapbox there for a minute, but I think that reality and expectation, you have to kind of hold both at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and just to add to that, I mean, I think it's useful to think of these as aspirational, statements like we're aspiring towards, but we are constantly in that process. And I really like the word dynamic, right? This idea that we're constantly changing. We can't keep doing the same thing to meet the needs of a changing demographic, whether it's for our students or our faculty and staff. Absolutely.
Yes. And if you're an adjunct who's hoping to be hired at another institution, I mean, although we always love for adjuncts that teach here to end up full-time here, these kinds of statements you can usually search on any school website, and their vision or mission statement should come up. And it's very important as you're looking at different institutions that you pay attention to. I don't think I realized this when I was newer to the field, but this can tell you a lot about an institution in terms of where they see themselves in the future.
Absolutely.
Okay, so with that in mind, speaking of the SMC vision statement and mission statement, we thought we would talk a little bit about the SMC equity plan and the framework that is included in the plan, because we do feel like in order to be an equity-minded practitioner, and remember, practitioner can sound like you've already arrived somewhere, right? But just engaging in this work and just trying to evolve over time means that you are in that practitioner role. So the tenets of this are based on authentic communication, cultural humility, high impact practices, and then culturally responsive facilitation and change management. And we're going to briefly connect it to what's outlined in Q, and then I'll go into a little more detail about what each of these categories contain.
Okay, so one of the things that's great about Q, and again, they're transitioning into the USC Race and Equity Center. I have to get used to the new name, is that they have a lot of tools available online. So if you actually go to the website, I mean, there are documents that you can download, there are webinars, very accessible information. So it's a really great place to kind of start and just get more information. But one of the things I think I really liked about one of their tools is the racial equity tool. And it really helps kind of lay the foundation and gives you practical steps. Like, so you've heard about this, you're like, okay, equity mindedness is great. We want to center equity. What does that actually look like? How do you actually do that? And they lay out this kind of process, as again, this ongoing process that you can go through. And we wanted to represent that as a pyramid because we really want to think about the foundation and the base. Because sometimes, when people get really excited and with the best of intentions, we want to kind of jump into solutions, like let's start doing things. But there's actually groundwork you have to do before you can get to the solutions. So the first thing is really laying the groundwork. And we're going to give some concrete definitions of that in just a second. Then you need to define the problem. So again, that kind of inquiry-based model where you say, okay, what's going on, defining the problem, and then only once you know the problem can you then start proposing solutions. So surprisingly, solutions is a third step. So again, it's a very different way of kind of thinking about it. But again, it's making sure that we're, again, not going off of assumptions, generalizations, or again, those kind of inherited traditions, but we're really letting the data inform how we make our decisions. And then finally, once we have some solutions, we have to think about how do we sustain the work and how do we scale the work against to the institutional level. Anything?
Yeah, and I yes.
I'll just assume I'm going to stop asking.
I told you I was chatty. So I think if you're somebody like me who's a fixer by nature, right? Shockingly, a department chair is a fixer by nature, right? I think it's for me, I have to constantly remind myself not to jump to solutions, because that's my whole life is spent trying to solve people's problems. But sometimes you can't solve the problem if you haven't really, well, most of the time, you can't solve the problem if you really don't look at the root of the issue and define what you're trying to solve. And I think even if you're not a fixer personality like me, as teachers, we often see ourselves as solution agents, right? Our students come in, we want to help them. So we think of all these different ways that we can quickly jump to putting them in a space where they can thrive. But if we don't listen to their stories and really think about what is happening and process that, then the solutions that we offer are probably not going to be intentional enough to do anything for them in the long run, right? Or change ourselves in the long run. So we may have temporarily solved something for, within that moment and been like, oh, great. But in the long run, we haven't changed our mindset, our practices, anything like that. I hope I haven't just further confused what you just said, Erica. But
I think it makes sense and it ties into the next.
oh, yes, next slide.
Yeah.
So what we thought we would do is take a look at that framework that we had referred to from the Student Equity Plan, and we would look at how that meshes with the model that we just showed you from Q, right? And so really thinking about laying the groundwork through authentic communication. And, I wrote down a couple of ideas of what that looks like, because I think it is so important that we think about the ways that when we go into a space, that we ensure that all voices are being heard in a discussion, changing conversation norms to ensure that we are providing safe spaces while addressing the reality of whatever that space is. Because most spaces have some type of conflict or misinformation. There are microaggressions that can occur, and unintentional wounding. And to give you an example of before I go on to the other stages, an example of a microaggression, which is what is a metaphor for like a tiny cut, right? That you don't, verbal, it's something that happens that on the surface doesn't appear harmful, but in reality is very harmful. So one day, it must have been a couple of years ago, we were at a meeting at Bundy, and a colleague and I went to what was the Overland Cafe. And we were sitting there, having our French fries. And this table, there was a table of a couple of Black people sitting towards the curb. And this white couple walked by, and their dog lunged at the table of Black customers. And the guy, I remember joking, said, "Oh, he's gonna get you." And I turned and I looked at my colleague, and I was like, "Did you just hear that?" And I'm certain that the guy that said that was just like, "Oh, ha, ha, my dog's not gonna hurt you. I'm just saying this." But what was not being acknowledged in that moment is the role that dogs have played in harming people of color, the way that dogs were used in policing, right? And so what that man thought was just, and again, remember, intention is not the same as reality, right? So what that guy thought was just a casual comment was really harmful, right? And so there's a myriad of ways in which that can play out in various meetings, in interactions with colleagues, in interactions with our students. And so really starting to think about that authentic communication, and stopping maybe in real time to process when something like that has happened, or at least processing it on the side, because if you're an adjunct, you may not feel like you can speak up in various scenarios, and that's totally, I get that, Erica, before I move on, do you have anything to add about the groundwork part?
No, I just have one example if we have time once we've gone through everything, but.
Okay. Oh, I love it. Okay. So, and then cultural humility, right? Being honest about the power imbalances that exist in a room, and thinking about who is getting challenged and who is being centered, right? Because if you don't walk in somewhere and think about who's being centered, then if you're centering the wrong people, you're not going to be able to ultimately make adjustments to that, right? And then thinking about high impact practices that really meet the needs of our, and not meet the needs, that engage and invite our Black and Latinx students to learn and thrive, right? So not just thinking about what are best practices in general, but what are best practices that are specific to Black and Latinx students. And then ultimately, sustaining that work and scaling it up through change management and culturally responsive facilitation. So this is, like thinking about who's best prepared in these situations to really keep the conversation equity focused. And, is there, if we are committed to centering Black and Latinx students, how do we go about ensuring that that actually takes place? So Erica, take it away.
Well, I just wanted to return back to one of those deficit-minded statements and kind of just work through what this could look like practically.
Yes. Yeah.
So if we think about the statement, for instance, that students are working too many hours and they don't have time to go to the tutoring center, right? Like if you think about laying the groundwork through authentic communication, it'd be first having a conversation about what's actually happening. Like, can you actually talk about, what's happening to your Black and Latinx students in your department, and just facilitate that conversation, right? Because if you can't even talk about it, then it's not going to be possible to actually define the problem and do the other things. And that's why this foundation is so important. And that's why it's at the base, of the pyramid. And then with cultural humility needed to discuss and define the problem, then we can start asking questions, right? Again, that inquiry-based model. Okay, why aren't they going to the tutoring center instead of assuming it's work? Like maybe there are other considerations, other factors. Even if the research just goes to confirm your existing assumptions, like you want to make sure that we're not just kind of, again, inheriting certain traditions, making certain assumptions, but we really have the humility to ask questions and to think about things in a different way. Right? And then that inquiry can lead to those kind of high impact anti-racist practices where maybe we say, based on the research or based on surveying our students, maybe we need to change the hours of the tutoring center, right? Maybe it's not that the students don't want to go, but maybe we need a different format, or maybe we need a different format. Maybe students have to go in person, right? It's different with this COVID, obviously, but maybe we need more online tutoring or something else that's available, right? But again, it comes from being able to have that kind of authentic communication, really being open and honest, and then really asking the questions that will lead to those practices. And then finally, of course, once you have a practice that's working, then you can sustain it and say, okay, how can we maintain this for the duration so that these programs or whatever changes don't just kind of fall away? But again, this is just echoing what Elisa said, but just kind of thinking through, like, what does that actual change look like in the department and, in the conversations you're already having? And I think, again, I just really want to emphasize the importance of that authentic communication. If you can't say these kinds of things, we can't kind of name that there are equity gaps happening with Black and Latinx students. If that's kind of like a tricky conversation, right, then that's where the work may be had. So again, this is this kind of ongoing process that can take, months or, extended periods before you actually get to kind of seeing the changes. And I think of it almost like a home renovation, like you're building the foundation, kind of doing all the other things, the lighting, the wiring, before you can get to the decorating and the pretty stuff. But again, and I think it's important to keep that in mind, because if you're expecting this kind of instantaneous change, like boom, we've talked about it, we had it one meeting and we talked about it, so let's get to those high impact practices. Sometimes that's not feasible. Sometimes a lot of the work is really facilitating those ongoing conversations, changing how we talk and think about our students. So again, we have to think about that ongoing practice and process for us as individuals, but then also for our colleagues as we kind of get everyone on board. And again, get our, at an institutional level, getting our departments and larger entities kind of centering equity. And I hope that doesn't sound too demoralizing. But again, as Elisa was saying earlier, we want to be realistic about what actually happens. It's not just that kind of one conversation and it's kind of a perfect sequential order, right? You may spend a lot of the time in kind of steps one, at the base of that foundation. But again, that work is essential because you can't really move forward before you do that work.
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better.
You're far too kind. I'm just piggybacking.
No,
you can imagine us in department meetings.
Yes, this is the part of the workshop where Erica and I exchange fondness for each other to the point where everybody's like, okay, yes, we know you appreciate each other.
And there are more slides. We'll keep moving.
Okay, so, Erica, you're talking about the first 2 points. I'm not talking. Sorry.
So again, and this is kind of what I was alluding to before. I just wanted to have the pyramid in front of me. So when you think about laying the groundwork through authentic communication, there's some questions that you can ask. Because again, I think sometimes everyone, I think a lot of people are really excited about doing equity work and want to do it. But again, kind of putting things into practice is where it kind of gets challenging. Like, how do I navigate these situations? So, when all else falls, I always like to rely on questions. Like, what kind of questions will kind of lead me to a different place, right? We don't always have to have the answers, but sometimes questions can just jumpstart a process. So some questions you can ask in kind of step one, phase one, to think about, how will I address conflict, misinformation, microaggressions, and unintentional wounding? So again, if you're thinking about that authentic communication, people may not say things in the way that you want them to. Conversations may not go perfectly, right? We've all been a part of department meetings. We can think of our own examples, right? So how do we move forward and address that so we can build a foundation and move on from that? How will I ensure students are heard and respected as partners in this process, right? So again, we can do a lot of talking about students and around students, but how are we really hearing from students? How can we ensure that we're making sure that we're actually meeting their needs and what they are today, which may be different from what they were a year ago? I think COVID is like a perfect example. Like, there's so many practices that we had that just kind of had to change instantaneously because the students' reality changed that quickly. And finally, in what ways and in what spaces can I model authentic communication? And I think this is really important and ties into something Elisa said earlier, because change is slow, right? It's an ongoing process. You never kind of perfect it, it doesn't end. But I think you see, when you start to make those own internal changes and you change how you talk about things, you ask different questions, and that gives other people the space to do the same thing. And you can, I mean, it's going to sound cheesy, but I think it's true. You can be the change that you want to see. And that's how you build that kind of buy-in from other colleagues in the department at other institutional levels. Again, it's not a speedy process. It's not just kind of this quick fix, but again, it's building that strong foundation so that actually, as you move forward, you have a strong foundation, and hopefully your colleagues will have the same as well. So when you start implementing changes, you can actually sustain them and they can have the impact that you want them to have. Do you want to chime into any? Or?
No, the only thing I will interject, which I should have said prior, is that these questions are taken from the student equity plan. And so I don't have the exact page number, but the student equity plan, which was actually commended by the state and by the chancellor's office and by the Center for Urban Education, it's one that they refer to in their trainings, has a lot of really useful information in it, including a definition of terms in the beginning. So if there are certain terms that you're like, oh, I'm not sure I know exactly what that means, that you can go and take a look. And that will also help lay that groundwork, right? Really looking into a group of people's methodology for how they rolled out an equity plan. So that's the only thing I'll add as an overarching thing. Sorry.
Absolutely. And just as an additional plug, there's a great executive summary. I mean, it's not that short, it's 25 pages, but you don't have to read the entire thing. It's really kind of organized in an accessible way so you can kind of pull out what you need. It's a fabulous document, if I say so myself. Okay. Okay, so moving up to the next level, level 2, using cultural humility to define and discuss the problem. Again, another series of questions that you can ask, right, to get the process started and maintain it. So what assumptions am I making about our work environment, right? So again, instead of just making assumptions and operating off of those assumptions, questioning those assumptions. Again, questioning will be so critical in so many ways. What cultural dynamics am I looking to challenge or center? And I think this is really important because, again, before you can get to formulating solutions, like, what am I actually trying to do? What are my goals here? Which groups am I trying to impact? And getting really specific. And again, I think that's where that inquiry-based model, using research and data to inform decisions, will be really helpful. So again, it's not just based on, this seems right, feelings or things that are hard to measure and then ultimately hard to evaluate, going off of what actually is happening on the ground. More questions. Why am I challenging or centering them? So again, having a reason for the particular approach that you're taking. Again, not just, this is the way we've done things, right? Which is something I've been surprised to hear, across my career, that's actually given as an answer for a number of reasons. Like, this is the way we've always done it. This is the way it's done in our field, right? I've heard that many times. So again, as giving a more central reason, a more evidence-based reason, that's again centering the work of students and their needs, asking those questions. And then finally, how will I disable power imbalances? So again, this is something Elisa's been alluding to, right? But we don't all enter these spaces with the same positionalities. We all have different roles and different levels of kind of power and reach in these different conversations. So how do we address those imbalances, again, as we try to make that systematic change? So again, sometimes asking these questions and going through this process helps clarify what we're trying to do, our own goals, giving a strong reason for them beyond just inherited traditions, and then saying, okay, what's our strategy here? How are we going to kind of navigate this kind of tricky field where there are a lot of different opinions. We've all been in department meetings, right? People have different opinions. They have different goals that they're trying to reach. And it's really about kind of centering what you think is best for the students and being able to articulate that. That will help kind of move things forward at the pace that makes sense for your particular department.
Yeah, and just to speak to that, the power dynamic, I think Eric and I, having both been adjuncts, understand that at times as an adjunct, you may not feel like you have a lot of authority in a particular space, depending on what that space looks like on campus. And, if you have associate status, that gives you a little more safety than if you're somebody who doesn't have associate status. But I think even just being conscientious of how that plays out in the classroom, or even how casual conversations between colleagues, how that might occur there too, can help you start to be more mindful when you enter larger spaces. I remember, I won't say which college I was at, but I remember going to a department meeting at another college. And I remember, I think I'd only been there maybe 2 days, and I saw a dean come into the meeting, and there were faculty members that were completely talking over her. And it was great. It was a little crazy. I'm not gonna lie. But I remember thinking, having been in other department meetings, seeing that, to me, helped me unpack some of the dynamics that were occurring within that space. And it helped me better understand the institution. It wasn't a bad institution. It was just, this is how things work at that institution. So I think, even if you're ultimately looking to be a part of a campus culture, you want to, when you enter those spaces, you want to take note of how those dynamics play out and ways in which you may be perpetuating them, but also ways in which you might want to you can say, okay, as an adjunct, I see this. Perhaps I should, start to ask questions of people I trust to help unpack what that reality is. Yeah. Can we pause real quick, Cyrus? Because we still have some time, and see if anybody has any questions about the first two, and then we'll go into the second two. Okay, so taking a look at the third and fourth parts of the plan, the third one would be inquiry through high impact and anti-racist practices. So really thinking about what HIPs, for the acronym for high impact practices, here are intentionally embedded to enhance learning and engagement of Latinx and African American students. I think there are plenty of times when I enter a space and people will say, well, we want all of our students to succeed, right? And oftentimes, I think Erica said this earlier, using high impact practices or policies that really center the students with the greatest racial equity gaps will benefit the other students, right? But if you don't center the students who need it the most, then you're more likely to keep perpetuating practices that center other people, specifically white students, or students in, now I'm losing vocabulary, but students in that have higher success rates or greater success rates. So the other thing is, asking yourself, am I showing up as a culturally humble expert who's learning and open to exploring new ideas? So again, remembering that you're on this journey and that you're constantly working and tweaking and thinking about ways in which your practices can be strengthened. And I was thinking about what that kind of looks like. And, when available, depending on the institution, you can gain access to your course success rates, right? And really look at your own course level racial equity data. And I think that can be, I remember we did this in our department a few years ago. And for some people, I can't remember, mine was not ideal, but it was like, okay, I'm a work in progress kind of thing. But I think, you know, really seeing the difference between how my white students were succeeding in a class versus how my Black students were succeeding, and really starting to unpack ways in which, even within my small space, I can really start to institute changes that will have greater impact for those students. And then, you know, being conscientious of the space you create within a class. You know, if I, as an English teacher, if I keep teaching literature that's written by white European men from 300 years ago, is that really engaging my students of color? Are they hearing voices of empowered individuals from similar backgrounds? And then also looking at making a, you know, just general adjustments to your pedagogy and, like I said, to the content. Erica, do you have anything to add to number 3 before I go on to 4?
Sure. I just have one example of something I've started doing recently. On the very first day of class when I teach English 1, kind of introductory composition, what I realized is that my students, I think it can be scary for students to enter an English classroom, right? I had to just own that and accept that. And I was like, okay, once I could own it, like I said, what am I going to do about it? And so we have an honest and open conversation about that. So we talk about, okay, what is it like? What has been your experience, you know, with English classes? And students will talk about what it feels like, you know, to get essays that are marked up with all these kind of corrections and being told that it's wrong, and you know, all of these different experiences that they've had. And what I've come up with now is something, and again, it's a work in progress, is that the very first day we have a conversation about all the different types of English that we use. So in the board, I'll write in like kind of tiny letters, academic English, right? That's the focus of our class. But then I talk about how do we use English in all these different ways, right? So people will talk about, you know, whether they're bilingual, you know, how they talk at home, how they talk, and it corresponds to the readings as well. So ultimately, without fail, and I've done this a few years, we will fill every single board in the classroom. I've done this in one classroom where we had like 5 boards. We filled every single board with all of these different examples. So then I could go back and then circle academic English and say, okay, we're going to focus on academic English, but that's just such a small part of what we do. And we had a visual reminder of all the different ways we communicated. And so then that activity allowed me to then say to students in an authentic way, you can bring your whole self here. I'm not here to change you. I'm not here to change how you speak. I'm just going to tell you about the kind of norms that we have for academic English, but I want you to bring your whole self, all the ways that you can communicate. And it's like you can feel the classroom kind of exhale and say, okay. And it creates such a different dynamic. And again, it doesn't take a lot of time, but just being able to talk in that way and let the students kind of dictate. It's very different for students. They're used to on the first day, the professor tells you all of these things, right? To kind of take the role of being, you know, the sage on the stage, right? But to give them that space and say, I want to hear from you, it just changes the dynamic, right? And that's just kind of one of the things that we do to build community in an authentic way, and to tell students, like, don't be afraid. Like, I'm not here to judge you, right? We're going to learn stuff, but that's not my goal. And I think what I realized is that I had to take that responsibility, knowing that I couldn't just assume my students were entering as kind of blank slates, right? They had this prior history, they had these expectations that I had to deal with head on. So I think, again, thinking about specific things that you can do and like how can you be humble in the classroom, right? It doesn't undermine your authority. It's really another way of connecting with your students and taking them on their learning journey and kind of framing it in a different way that may be more meaningful to them, but also more welcoming to them. And I can't tell you how many times students have talked about that activity. It just changes everything. And again, and I hear from colleagues who do similar things as well. But again, that's not something I learned in grad school. That's not something I read in a book. It was just finally kind of acknowledging something that kind of been in the back of my mind. It's like, how are we thinking about English? What does it mean to enter an English classroom? And like, let's deal with that. So that was one of the, you know, one of the ways that I try to take responsibility. But again, I'm constantly learning from my colleagues as well. So I think just thinking about so much of what you can do in the classroom. And again, it doesn't necessarily take up that much time. It's not like it's a new unit, but really just kind of shifting the conversation in these ways can really pay dividends, both in terms of student engagement. I noticed a big difference in terms of my retention. When I reached out to students, I got more responses. Like it just paid off in so many different ways.
Don't you all want to take Erica's class?
I'm auditing yours first. This is what we do.
I can see Cyrus nodding. He's like, yes, I like this. Um, so the last thing to think about, and this is an interesting kind of space to occupy as an adjunct, is the idea of sustaining and scaling up the work. So I'm gonna talk about a couple of questions that are a part of that, but then I think we should take a moment and think about what that might look like as an adjunct versus a full-time faculty member, because I do think it will look a little different. So when it comes to asking questions about sustaining and scaling up work, I think, thinking about, am I prepared to commit to dialogue that squarely centers our examination and decisions at the college around Latinx and African American students? Now, that is something that you can think about as you're walking into meetings, department meetings, or if you're on a committee, or if you happen to be working on a certain project, you can really start to see whether or not that's being centered, and ways in which that you can try and interject some of that depending on the politics of the space, right? And how that can be done. And then also, like, am I committed to communication styles that value calling in versus calling out? And it's Veronica Kiefer Lewis, right? Okay. She is, if you ever have a chance to listen to her, she's amazing, right? At that idea of calling people in, that when you walk into a space and you immediately put people in a defensive stance, the chances that change or growth is going to happen diminishes, right? And depending on the situation, I mean, I've been in situations where calling in did seem more appropriate, and there's been a couple of times, as a full-time faculty member in a chair, where I feel like I do have to say what's actually happening, right? But as an adjunct, obviously you're more mindful, because I know I was too, like the level to which I felt like I could push against something, and when I felt like I needed to just kind of have an opinion but keep it to myself. And so the way I would say that step number 4 can occur, and it really depends again on what your long-term aspirations are. But really, when you go into these spaces, looking around the room and paying attention to the statements that people are making, and seeing who's making more of these equity-minded statements, and then following up with those people outside of the meeting to kind of unpack or have a conversation that helps move those ideas forward. So you're not necessarily positioning yourself in a meeting to have any backlash, if there is such, but you're also participating in those conversations to help scale up that work. And then the other thing I would say is, when you go to different equity trainings on a campus, really start to see who keeps showing up, right? It doesn't always have to be people in your department. It can be, like, oh, I mean, that's how there's a professor in another department, and we kept seeing each other showing up to things that were about a similar topic, right? About white anti-racist work. And so I automatically thought to myself, okay, then this is somebody I can have a conversation with about how white people on campus can be more proactive in closing racial equity gaps and supporting our colleagues of color, right? So, if even, and then the last example I'll give, and Erica, I hope you have better examples. But the other thing would be to say that, when you're in a space, and I think I kind of alluded to this before, but, if you're in a staff room, or if you're in a location where a colleague of color is attempting to assert an opinion or clarify something for other people, even just stepping in and saying, yes, that I know exactly what this person is talking about. I've seen it in this other situation. You can help legitimize voices when you collectively show agreement about something, right? And I think that is something I know, even as a white woman, I have felt at times that if I was saying something, I'm like, are people thinking I'm crazy? And then somebody comes in and says, no, Elisa knows what she's talking about. And immediately I have this moment of like, oh dear God, I do know what I'm talking about. Why did I doubt myself? And I think we can show up for our colleagues of color and really make sure that we're affirming those opinions. Erica, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Just quickly, excuse me, just quickly. No, I really like the idea. I mean, when you were talking about, kind of supporting what other colleagues have had to say, particularly colleagues of color, like that reminded me of the idea of kind of amplifying, certain voices, and kind of reestablishing like there is not just one individual who's thinking
Right.
or this way, but that there's a group suddenly, right? 1 to 2, right? Goes individual to group, that can have a huge impact. And again, I think that's one way to also negate some of the microaggressions that colleagues may feel as well, because it can be very isolating if you say something and then just kind of falls flat and there's silence. And then people just move on. And that's not very affirming. So I think in terms of both moving the departmental or whatever level you're at, moving the work forward, that's helpful, but then also for those colleagues as well, that can be a way to kind of negate those microaggressions. So again, these things can have multiple impacts. The other thing I was just going to add, and I'm going to sound like a broken record because I'm a fan of this, is that particularly when I'm in spaces where either, and I think about this as I'm a tenure track, like probationary faculty member, right? There's different levels to this, right? And depending on where you are, that may determine, how comfortable you feel in certain spaces. So I'm mindful of this as a probationary faculty member, or even where I'm in spaces where I'm not sure kind of the power dynamics, and I'm not like, I don't know someone, and like, if I say something. So sometimes making statements can feel a little worrisome. But sometimes it can be helpful just to ask a clarifying question, right? So if someone makes a statement and it seems like they're making like maybe a deficit minded statement, you can just ask them to clarify, or you can ask them like, is this, it seems like you're suggesting this. Am I understanding correctly? Like there's very non-threatening ways to just kind of question and probe that. And then that gives other people, sometimes people with more power in the room, to then kind of jump in and then say, okay, well, let's maybe change how we're thinking about it as well. So sometimes I think, again, statements can feel very definitive. It can maybe sometimes aggressive in certain spaces, but just kind of asking that little old innocent question can do a lot. And I think about kind of in grad school days, right? Sometimes it's the art of asking a well-timed question can be really effective. But again, you're not going to get that same pushback. It really kind of takes it to the entire group to kind of just meditate and think about what you're suggesting. And then for them to kind of pause and say, is this what I really meant? Because sometimes people just say things, again, we have these ways of talking, these inherited traditions. So sometimes just pausing, well, maybe I didn't. And that can give you, again, information about what's going on in the dynamic, because that may tell you, oh, this is just the way people have done things. And maybe if we talk about things in a different way, that could lead to change. So again, sometimes just asking questions, just gives you a lot of information about the people in the room, how things are operating. And then it can help you kind of refine your strategy for trying to move the work forward.
No, and I love people that are able to, in real time, pause and say, oh, maybe I didn't mean what I just, like, and as those that may be in the room with that person, allowing people to have a moment where they say something and they're like, no, wait, that's not what I meant. And really letting people unpack that in real time, in a very genuine way. Like, to me, that's part of the authentic communication, right? If we truly want to have these difficult conversations, then we have to leave space for people to say things on occasion that are not ideal, I guess, for lack of a better phrase, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And again, I think that's another way of kind of calling people in, right? As opposed to calling people out, you said this, therefore.
Right,
It's
right.
it's like, I'm just gonna let you rethink that, right? And sometimes people appreciate those kind of gracious gestures that you can make, right? When people realize, and again, that's another way to kind of build goodwill among colleagues and get more buy-in as well. As you mentioned, earlier, Lisa, that people don't like being in a defensive position where they have to kind of defend themselves, and their integrity and the way that they've been teaching. So again, alternative ways of kind of framing conversations can be really helpful to move the work forward, and again, build support with your colleagues.
Yeah.
So then
Okay. So I don't think, my guess is people don't have questions about 3 and 4, or if they do, we can answer them at the end.
as I move forward.
Yes.
Too late.
Yeah. Okay, this is my part. So what we thought we would do is just highlight a couple of tools that we feel are helpful, and some of them are more based at SMC, and then other tools are outside of the institution. But I just want to highlight that if there's a different college that you're looking at, the reading their student equity plan, which is something that the Chancellor's office asked every school to turn in. So there are a variety of plans. So any institution should have this available for you to read. And like Erica said, the executive summary is very useful. And we can send, maybe as part of the recording, we'll have a link to these documents under the recording, maybe, Cyrus, if that'll work for you. And then really looking at institutional data and reports. racial equity gaps and other equity data has to be published by various institutions, and it is made accessible to the public. So, you know, taking a look at what that data looks like, because you may not have access to your course level data. Although I have to tell you, even at the end of every semester, I kind of try to do my own self-assessment about my own course success rates within that semester. So even if you take a moment and pause and reflect at the end of the semester to think about what worked and what didn't and how you can improve, is also useful. And then the SMC, the Equity Diversity Committee, which is attached to the Senate, made this amazing faculty equity resource guide, and I know Erica would recommend it as well. It's amazing, and it has a lot of useful information in it. So that would be another resource on top of the various seminars and webinars that are now provided for professional development.
Absolutely. That's one of the things I was really impressed with when I first came to SMC, and I just did a search on the website, like what's going on with equity, and just kind of getting a sense of how things work. And it's like, oh, okay, we've got the equity plan. Oh, we've got this equity guide. Like, okay, so we're giving people practical tools that they can implement. Like that was really outstanding. And outside of SMC, there are a number of resources as well. Again, we provided you with some of kind of the major research centers that SMC often works with, but there are a lot of other resources online. There are links to racial equity work in education. And one of the things that's nice, I'm just going to kind of talk about a lot of these together, is that given where everything is at and the kind of work that's been done, I mean, if we were having this conversation maybe, 5-10 years ago, we'd be in a different space. But I just feel like now you really can just go online and kind of search equity in higher ed, and you'll get some really great articles. You'll get links to, webinars. We have some link to what is, I guess, what is formerly known as Q. Sounds like Prince when he renamed himself.
Yes.
There's a less cumbersome way to say that. So Q has some, but I mean, there's a lot of energy around kind of higher ed in general around equity. So I think it makes it easier to kind of enter these conversations and to see the work that people are doing. So I think it's a really exciting time. One of the things I really want to highlight is the syllabus review through Q. That's been a really interesting process to go through, because sometimes I feel like we have these conversations and as faculty, it's like, okay, what can I actually do? And like, how impactful are these changes going to be? And then going through something like the syllabus review, where you actually go through your syllabus and kind of say, okay, how am I talking to students? What's the first impression that I'm giving to students? The way that we sometimes imagine how we communicate to students may not necessarily align with the way that we're communicating in the documents that we give students. So thinking about the syllabus is kind of a first introduction. So, okay, how can we be equity minded in the syllabus? How do we tell students how to be successful in the class? That was one of the most eye-opening things when I went through one of those webinars. It's like, it never occurred to me to have a section in my syllabus where it said, this is what you need to do to be successful, right? It was always this kind of like mystery, like you'll just figure out, like, just take the class and it will become known to you in these kind of abstract ways. Like, and again, that's just that inherited tradition of how education has been. But when you go through these kind of practical tools, you realize that there are a lot of different concrete things that you can do that make a real impact on student success. And then we have a couple of books, and I feel like, in light of the conversations that this country has been having over the past year, like you'll find tons of reading lists as well. So these are just a couple of books that are recommended, from Equity Walk to Equity Talk to Equity Walk by Stella Ben Simon, who's retiring. And again, you'll find that with a lot of her work, through Q, through USC, I mean, her name is going to pop up a lot because she's really kind of a pioneer. I mean, I think she created Q, I think like in 1999, and really kind of pushes kind of data-informed approach to thinking about closing equity gaps and really challenging institutions to think about how they operate and what they can do differently to better serve Black and Latinx students to close those gaps. And then How to Be an Anti-Racist, which I feel like has been on every reading list that I've seen this summer. Highly recommended. If you can find it, I think it was sold out over the summer. But again, I think the thing to really stress is that there's a lot of great information out there that's already been curated. So just kind of doing some searches and then kind of seeing what piques your interest, where you want to move. Sometimes starting with reading books and just kind of getting a general lay of the land can be really informative. If you're ready to move forward and say, okay, let me get into like the syllabus review or specific, webinars where I can get practical tips, you can really decide about how you want to move the work forward. I think the big thing is kind of just figuring out what the next step is going to be for yourself. And I'll just make one last plug. And I just thought about it. We've had so many conversations. I just thought about it. through, I think it's 3CSN, if I'm getting the acronym right. There have been a number of webinars as well about serving students. Some of them have been explicitly related to equity, but a lot of them have been related to better serving students through during COVID and through remote instruction as well. So again, there's so many resources that's available to us as faculty members in the community college system that's about helping students in really kind of concrete and practical ways. So it's really just about picking what's most interesting to you.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd like to add is just thinking about if you're an adjunct who's ultimately applying for a full-time position, and being a what being a full-time faculty member at an equity minded institution looks like, is that participating in these activities and articulating what you have done when you're in interviews, but like that helps people better understand where you are at as an individual who wants to work at an equity minded institution, right? Um, and don't, the other thing I would say is, there have been times when I've engaged in conversations or I've heard pieces of information and I take it in, but it doesn't quite click until months or years later, right? So, be mindful that as helpful as most of this information is, it may not all connect to you right in that moment. And that's okay, as long as you continue to try and think about it and sit in it, and then, and talk with people, discuss it with other people. Um, yeah, and from Equity Talk to Equity Walk is amazing, and it's not very long. So I just want to make a quick plug for that one. So, okay, I think all that's left is, whoa, yeah, that's all that's left is coming up with a plan,
That little thing.
which you may or I don't think we'll go into breakout groups because there's not enough of us. But Erica, do you want to go ahead, and I didn't mean to steal your.
It's fine. So I think, like you said, we can just have a larger conversation and maybe we'll just kind of talk. Maybe what we can do is kind of wrap up and then kind of have a conversation off camera just because it's such a small
Yeah,
group right
I think
now.
that's a great idea.
But we did want to kind of go through again those kind of next steps. So in addition to providing those tools that you can look at, we want to think about again creating this plan because I think as Elisa's saying, it's helpful to think about, okay, how am I going to be an equity practitioner, as, an adjunct faculty member, and then what are my goals in terms if I go on to a full-time position as well. And I think kind of having that, a little bit of that foresight can be really helpful as you kind of plan, the different activities you want to get involved in. Maybe it informs, some of the committee work or, professional development activities you participate in as well. So we thought it'd be nice to end with creating a plan. And really, when we say plan, it's really just kind of identifying concrete next steps that you can take as you continue on this journey. Because again, we're all on this journey. It doesn't end. It's a process that we're constantly going through. So, excuse me. So what we're going to have you do is just to do three things to go back to the equity pyramid and identify where you feel that you fit on that pyramid. So when you think about again, like authentic, laying the groundwork, thinking about authentic communication and the steps kind of building up from there, where do you feel like you should start in the equity journey? If you're thinking about, level one, authentic communication, you could think about how you're communicating with your colleagues in the department. You can think about how you're communicating with your students as well. Then from there, thinking about where you identify, how you identify your department and where your department fits in the pyramid. And I think this is a really important thing to do in tandem because sometimes where we are is not necessarily where our department is at. And if there's a kind of mismatch, that's important to know up front and say, okay, I feel like I'm here, but my department's down here, and kind of figuring out how do you, again, navigate that terrain? How do you move forward as an individual practitioner, but kind of move the work forward? Or vice versa, if you feel like your department is having these very advanced conversations about equity that's been going on for like 10 years, and like, I'm brand new and I'm just getting started, how can you move forward in a way that makes sense for you, but still participate? So again, just kind of figuring out where you fit as well as where your department fits can help you come up with those concrete steps. And then finally, based on the answers to 1 and 2, then you'd create an equity action plan with a few steps that you can take to continue on your equity journey. So based on the information from points 1 and 2, then do you think it makes more sense to participate in webinars? That could be something that's helpful if you feel like your department's having these very advanced conversations and you want to start to get caught up. You're like, okay, let me read more information. Let me hear more about this. So it'll make more sense when I enter those spaces in my department. If you're focusing more on your individual development, like maybe thinking about books, again, I'm gonna keep plugging this, anything by Stella Benson, like it's certain names that if you hear, it's like if you hear Stella Benson, if you hear Veronica Kiefer Lewis, right? Those are just kind of like go-tos because they're just such wonderful resources. And they've just been so helpful in working in so many different departments. I mean, I've worked with Veronica in multiple institutions now, and she's fabulous. So again, we want to, instead of just kind of saying, this is what you need to do, we really want to think about creating an individualized plan that makes sense for you in terms of where you're at, but also the institution or institutions that you're at, so that again, you find a way to move forward that makes sense in light of this particular dynamics of your department. I feel like the more I talk, the more confusing I get. So I'm going to stop.
I get it. It's the afternoon. I think that's part of it. And I just realized too, something to consider as maybe a fourth step is after you look at your action plan, maybe identify one or two, maybe three people that you want to show your action plan to, or one or a couple people that you feel might be able to connect you with different people on campus. I think even if as an adjunct, you know, if you are uncertain of who to talk to, there are probably people in your department that can tell you exactly who you should be talking to. And so, you know, and that could be your chair, but it could also be somebody who's most recently observed you, or someone that you happen to, well, when we're on ground, somebody that you engage in side chats with, right? I think, or even looking at the chat in a meeting, right? And if you see that somebody is speaking up about something and you're interested in what they're talking about, maybe following up with them via email or sending them a quick note in the chat to say, hey, I would really like to connect with you and talk about what you were just referring to and whatnot. So,
I think that's, I just want to add really quickly, sorry.
No.
I think that's a really great point. And I think that's something I've tried to do as just in general, as like a new hire in any institution, getting to know people. And it's really kind of finding people like who have similar interests, like anything that you can connect with people. So I think again, as you're going on this journey, it's not something that you're doing by yourself. And I think it's something to really emphasize. It's really about finding people who either can help you get to where you want to go, people who are at a similar stage. Sometimes that can be really nice, like through orientations, or if you find that you're kind of gravitating towards certain people or making similar comments. So you can really build a community that will support you on this work because you don't want to feel isolated. And again, thinking about the goal being systematic change, you need to be working with other people as well. It's not just about being in silos. So finding those people who kind of complement where you are, and that may change, you know, as you go from maybe starting the equity journey to, you know, once you've been on it for a few years, you know, you may find that you're then mentoring people and you're in a different position as well. And I think that part is really beautiful as well when people start coming to you.
So then I guess on that note, do we want to we'll wrap it up real quick and then we can just chat off record. So I think just a couple of closing thoughts, and Erica, if you have any to add, feel free. But you know, regardless of where you started at the beginning of this workshop, just remember that there's room for all of us to grow. I am constantly reminded of this statement and humbled by it on a regular basis. And you know, even in giving this presentation, I'm sure for the rest of the day, I'm going to be like thinking about ways that all of this could have played out differently, and how it, you know, what happens in the future. And you know, being equity minded is challenging, but it's worth it. I think oftentimes, particularly, and I'm going to speak as a white person, you know, it is difficult to enter a space and not center myself and white needs, right? Because I've been told all along that that was allowed. And I think when you start to see how that plays out and the ways in which it affects your colleagues of color, and then ultimately your students of color, you become such a more well-rounded individual. You feel like you are truly engaging in a community when you're doing this work, because you have found, I think you found like-minded people who are just trying to make a better space for our students, and particularly our Black and Latinx students. And the other thing is, and this applies to even if you watch the recording, we're grateful for your willingness to engage in this conversation, even if you couldn't be here in real time. So, you know, as you're in the same way that I will sit with what has happened today, I think Eric and I hope that You too will continue to think about points that were made today, and ask questions. And like we've said, feel free to reach out to us, and that you can do this work regardless of where you are in this journey. You can do it. So really, don't shy away from it, because it will get complicated in a myriad of ways, but the benefits of it far outweigh the complexity. Erica, what do you think?
Beautifully said. Well, so I've just been thinking about some of the advice that I've been given over the years. And I'll just share an anecdote. I participated in the Classified and Faculty Staff Summer Institute, CFSI. Sorry, acronyms get me. Right when I started, actually right before I started as a new faculty member at SMC. And Veronica Kiefer Lewis was there, and we had a number of conversations. And toward the end, I asked her, I said, okay, I'm trying to do this work, but like the thing that was hanging me up is like, I'm so worried that I'm going to get something wrong, that I'm going to do harm. And she just looked at me, and with so much kindness, like she's just such an amazing person. Like she's one of those people that you just feel lucky to be in her presence. Like, just thank you for being here. But she looked at me and she said, you're going to do harm. She's like, we've all done harm. She says she thinks about, the harm that she's done, and which kind of blew my mind. I had this amazing person who's coming in as this expert to kind of facilitate this conversation, just being open and honest and saying that she makes mistakes. And she's like, she will continue to make mistakes. She's like, and she told me I will continue to make mistakes. But the point is that you keep trying to do better. Right. And when you know that you make a mistake, you do your best to fix it and you try to move on. And that's the journey that we're all on. And for me, that was really profound, like having come from doing all this equity work and have done, written equity plans and doing things like, that shifted my perspective, so it was just funny that even after I had, all of this quote unquote experience, right, that simple conversation was able just to change my perspective in so many different ways, and to just accept I'm not going to get it right. And that's okay. We're going to make mistakes, and that's part of the process. You just keep moving. And that's something that really kind of hung me up. It's like, I don't want to make a mistake. I don't want to cause harm. Like, that you can do all of these things and have all these impacts, right? Some ways it can be paralyzing. And she's like, no, just do your best. And I think that's a really healthy way to approach it, and just to be forgiving with yourself. You're going to make mistakes. We all do. But the question then becomes, what do you do about it? And how do you move forward? And I think, and that's where you really see the work kind of continue and the cycle kind of repeat itself. So just thank you for being here and or watching at home.
And then we'll go ahead and stop with popcorn, just eating popcorn and watching. So we're going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we can answer questions or talk for the remainder of the time.
Whatever would be helpful.
Yeah.